Thank you, everyone. I'm joined with Vassilis here. My name is Dimitris Anassis. We're with Hill Dickinson. Thank you very much for your introduction and your kind words. If we can have the next slide, please. You may have heard of Hill Dickinson. We're an international law firm. We've got a number of offices across the world, and we have been privileged enough to be involved in considerable depth in terms of a number of initiatives, mostly behind the scenes, including in terms of the IMO's and the EU's efforts to decarbonize. We're here we've had the privilege of listening to the previous presentations, which we thought were very insightful. I don't think there is an overlap, although there may appear to be in terms of the issues that we're going to be dealing with today. We're here mostly to give you how we see these matters developing from a practical perspective, how our clients deal with them, what the potential disputes that may arise, because we're, particularly Vassilis and I, are litigators, how we try to prevent disputes from arising, and what the future holds, and what we think this whole effort towards decarbonization is going to achieve. We're not going to, we're trying, we will resist, we've discussed it, we will resist touching on geopolitical developments. I don't think there's time for that. Plus, we would need another several hours to discuss. So I'm going to hand over to Vassilis to start, and then we've discussed and we've decided that we'll be interjecting with one another in terms of a number of issues. So I'll let Vassilis start.
Yes, hi from me. Thanks, Dimitri. As Dimitri said, this presentation will predominantly focus on key practical points we see in everyday practice. It will not go into too much detail on the structure, on the logic. It will go to what we think is the real core behind what is the practical meaning of decarbonization, seen from the perspective of the people who need to decarbonize, really. You see on the slide the reference to policy documents. Obviously, these are the sort of the wish list, saying what we want the world to look like in 10, 15, 20, 40 years. And eventually will be net zero, and everything will be green, and everything will be perfect. And that goes both for the IMO, which, as discussed, is a global sort of organization. Its directives, decisions need then to be implemented by the individual member states, and also for the EU. But this is just, as I said, the wishful thinking behind what is the practical reality. And the practical reality, as far as we're concerned, for the purposes of this presentation, can boil down to what you see on the screen. In terms of the IMO, it's some key points in Annex 6 of the MARPOL, which is the EEXI and the EEDI. We'll get to what that means in a minute, and the CII. And in terms of EU regulations, that's the EU ETS, the Emissions Trading Scheme, and Fuel EU Maritime. Now, EEXI and EEDI, what are those acronyms? The EEXI and EEDI are essentially indexes that show how efficient a vessel is. The EEDI refers to a new building, and it shows how efficient it has been built to be. And the EEXI just takes a snapshot of the vessel in its current state, and it shows how efficient it is. If predominantly for the existing vessels, if a vessel falls below what is expected to meet in terms of its EEXI index, the owner will need to make modifications so that the efficiency of the vessel increases and the required threshold is achieved. The positive, from the owner's perspective, the positive aspect of the EEXI and the EEDI is that it is essentially an index for life. So if you get it and you do not change the vessel structure in a material way, in a way that affects the vessel's efficiency materially, then you can go ahead until you essentially scrap the vessel and not have to do anything about that. Of course, there are scenarios where the energy efficiency of the vessel is affected, some of which you can see on the slide, in which case the index will need to be recalculated. So that, in a nutshell, is the EEXI and the EEDI. The CII, the carbon intensity indicator, is a bit more intricate because it refers to the active operation of the vessel, essentially. It measures how many grams of CO2 are emitted by the vessel. And it correlates to the cargo carrying capacity and the distance traveled. The question, as far as we are concerned as lawyers of practice, is, okay, so who is obliged to meet this? Who is obliged to meet the CII, and who effectively is to blame when the relevant requirements are not met? That is the registered owner, of course. But the registered owner rarely operates the vessel on its own behalf. It usually charters the vessel out, and it does so on a time charter basis. What that means is there's a contract, and the owner tells the charterer, okay, you're going to pay me X amount of money every 15 days, and I will do everything you tell me to do with the vessel, provided that it's lawful, etc., etc. So what this means is that the CII is an obligation on the owner, but it is affected by how the charterer directs the owner, but by what orders the charterer gives the owner in relation to the vessel. Now, disputes lawyers see this as a source of work because this has a lot of potential for disputes, and we'll get to that in a short while. How is CII calculated? You can see it on the screen. As we said, it's a combination of fuel consumed, of distance traveled, of the capacity of the vessel, and also of correction factors to reflect the practical reality. And that will be the subject of the next slide. So one calculates this attained CII, it's the operational CII essentially. Then there's another benchmark value, which is the required CII. It's effectively a benchmark value that gets increasingly more difficult to meet, so that owners have incentive to make their vessels more efficient as time goes on. And the correlation of the attained and the required CII gives you a CII rating. C meaning, okay, you've met the mark. A and B means you've exceeded the mark, and D and D means you fall below par. This rating is recorded on the vessel's statement of compliance and stays with the vessel. And if there's a prolonged failure to meet the required threshold, which is level C, or an egregious failure to meet that, the vessel is awarded a rating of E, then the vessel will need to, the owner essentially, will need to take steps and be seen to take steps to rectify this shortcoming. All of this information that on which the CII calculation is premised must be reported to a third-party independent verifier so that it can be ensured that it's accurate. However, the issue with the CII is that there are no real penalties presently. Again, I'll be using the phrase "as far as we're concerned" quite often because this is what we see in practice. A lot of what we do in terms of contracts and charter parties has to do with owners and charterers trying to find middle ground about, okay, how do we strike an agreement as to who will be responsible to meet the threshold, and what happens if we don't meet the threshold, and where does, because the CII is calculated every year, how do we arrange our affairs so that we don't have to wait for a year to see if who's wrong and who's right. Now, as I said before, the calculation on its own would have been detached from reality, but for what is defined as correction factors. And some of those correction factors, the correction factors that have been taken into account can be seen in green in this slide. The ones that have not been taken into account are the ones in red. Just a brief overview shows a pattern. You can see on the list, in the list on the left, that there's reference to LNG, there's reference to reefers, there's reference to cargo heating, which directs one's mind to wet cargo, to fuel, to tankers. But the core of Greek shipping, which is dry bulk cargo carriage, is not represented. That's, as far as we see it, is a lobbying failure, essentially, and one that, from a practical perspective, creates a vacuum, which the parties will need to make up on their own by agreeing. And of course, in a more sort of general, in a broader, more macroscopic level, lobbying exercises will need to be undertaken in order to rectify this, as far as the dry bulk cargo market is concerned. In very brief, very short, very succinct terms, that's the CII and the EXI, EDI. That's the core of the practical core of the operational sort of side of the IMO regulations.
Sorry, Vassilis, I'll just interject here. I think it's important to note, and this is going to be, I think, an insightful pattern that one may notice in terms of the EU ETS and Fuel EU Maritime regulations. It's interesting that BIMCO, being an owner-driven global organization that seeks to assist parties with, amongst other things, devising charter party terms, they struggled quite a lot with producing an effective provision, an effective clause that can go in charter parties that arranges what Vassilis said, basically that regulates the responsibility. It's very difficult, as Vassilis said, when you have the owner who's responsible for the CII rating, yet the charter's decision define such rating. It's extremely difficult to contractually assess and split the risk. We were behind the scenes in the compilation of the BIMCO CII clause, which came out. It's extremely complicated, very convoluted. We've seen it very rarely being accepted in practice. And indeed, all the major charters that took part in these deliberations, the very next day, led by Cargill, said, that's a fantastic clause that we've agreed. We're not going to be implementing it. Here's our clause. And the gist of it is that although the BIMCO clause provided for an absolute obligation on the part of the charterer to ensure that the vessel's CII would remain as agreed, it only provided for a due diligence, i.e. an inferior obligation on the part of the owner to do their part. So at the moment, the parties, basically all the CII clauses we see are based on endeavors. So the parties will endeavor, whether to reasonably endeavor or exercise best endeavors is a different story, but it's just an endeavor. So effectively, it is necessary to collaborate. Of course, the fact that, as Vassilis said, there are no real repercussions. A recent IMO subcommittee found that a low or a subpar CII rating is not a detainable offense. So basically, there's no repercussions. That's basically led CII ratings to sort of die a death in terms of application. No doubt everybody's recording their data and so on. And what we've been telling our clients is that it may not be long until the IMO says, right, now here's the repercussions. So CII will sort of fall back into the scene. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, I think this pretty much covers the aspect of the CII. You see, it's a good sort of initiative. It's obviously the drive towards decarbonization is commendable, but when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, when it comes down to, okay, how do we do this? Who is responsible? How do we agree? How do we split? How do we explain it to one another so that we're content that that what we've agreed is just and it's workable, then that's where the real problems start from a practical perspective. On to a difference of a different regulation, that's the EU ETS directive, that operates in a very different way. Obviously, an EU ETS scheme operated outside of shipping. It's now that shipping has joined the party. And what the EU ETS is that it is essentially a cap and trade system, which means there's a cap, falling cap, which says, okay, there's a limit to the CO emissions that you can emit, essentially. And it allows, it provides for a sort of a monetization, a monetary equivalent unit with which to exchange emissions. Essentially, it's a tax without all the niceties. I think what we say about the expanding, so the cap is lowering, but the scope is expanding because outside of CO2 emissions, other greenhouse gases will soon join the party. That will be nitrous oxide and methane. That they will be captured in the reported emissions for 2026. So watch the space. And it's not only the scope of the greenhouse gases that's expanding, it's also the ratio of the quantity of emissions given out and how much, what kind of percentage of those emissions one needs to trade off with allowances, essentially. And we'll explain what that means very, very shortly. So the way the EU ETS operates is that operators, meaning essentially ship owners or the entities responsible for compliance, essentially the ISM companies, as those in shipping will know them, which can include bareboat charterers, as well as registered owners under certain circumstances. They need to buy allowances, which are effectively tokens, as monetary units, which correlate to CO2 emissions. And they use those tokens against a steadily growing part of the emissions given out within the EU and the EEA. There are, if we've underlined qualifying routes and protocols because there's a differentiation. Within EU or EEA, those routes are fully covered. Trips into or outside of the EU, so if a vessel enters the EU from outside or leaves the EU, those trips will count as 50%. So the responsibility is hard. So the EUAs can be bought either at auctions and the European Energy Exchange or in the secondary market. Of course, not all allowances have to be used. Those that have not been used can be stored and kept for later use, or they can be traded. The starting problem with the EU ETS was, again, okay, so who pays for all this? There was some tussle between owners and charterers, and then BIDCO came out and provided a very, very balanced and very well drafted clause. But as things progress, it is now essentially it's market practice that the charterers accept that EU allowances are essentially a product of their own orders, and they've accepted that it's they that will need to pay for them ultimately. Now, related to this is what we say that the EU ETS has been incorporated in world scale. World scale is a freight scale. It's a method, it's a standard method, frequently used when tankers are fixed to carry oil cargoes on a voyage basis. It's essentially an index that takes into account various types of parameters in order to reach a freight level. And now the 2025 version has taken into account the need for EU allowances under the EU ETS scheme. Dimitri, is there anything you want to add before we move on to?
Yes, thanks. Just very briefly, going back to what we just discussed in terms of CII and the reactions and the initial reactions were when it sort of came out and it came into effect. The very same issues we had with EU ETS. There were some initial teething problems, as we call them, in that there was a great discussion in terms of who gets the mandate. What happens when there's a bareboat charter involved? So when the owner has completely relinquished control to a charter that simply pays higher, how it all works. There were a few months of difficulty, but it all sort of then became rather clear. As Vassilis said, what did help was that BIMCO released a number of clauses, including in relation to management agreements, and so on, that made things considerably easier, to the point that we very rarely now hear about disputes or potential disputes in terms of EU ETS. So, and of course, the incorporation in world scale means that EU ETS is simply going to be there as an additional tax. It's going to be taken into account when world scale calculates how much per ton a carrier is to charge, and then life goes on.
Yeah, and back to a more sort of practical aspect of the EU, of the BIMCO clause, which is very, very helpful for owners, is that it includes a right of the owner to suspend service. So it says that, well, there's a regular reporting going on between owners and charterers about how many EU allowances have been used up. And if during the process of the charter party, the charter fails to transfer the requisite amount of EU allowances, the owner can say, okay, that's enough. I'm not doing anything until you comply with the clause. The vessel stays where she is. It's not loading. That's a superpower in the hands of the owners. So on to the next piece of EU legislation. That's a pure EU maritime regulation, which goes straight out of the bat beyond CO2 and captures the usual trifecta of greenhouse gases. Now, the biofuel solution, but essentially the practical reality is that the steadily falling limit of GHG intensity that's required under pure EU maritime, essentially it means that vessels will need to use biofuel blends in order to make it and operate within the emissions thresholds. Now that's all well and good, but the issue is that this comes not just at a substantial cost that trickles down into the receivers, the charterers, receivers, the end users, the end receivers of the products, the end consumers. It's also that it's not all biofuels that qualify to be used under the pure EU maritime. Those need to be sustainable, and the demand, we're shipping to decarbonize tomorrow. The demand for biofuels would be huge. It would be so big that it's quite difficult to imagine how, to what extent biofuels would be a sustainable and a financially viable alternative. In any event, that's now law. It's how it is. Going forward, we'll just the owners and their commercial counterparts, which is essentially the charterers, will need to figure out a way to make things work. A significant aspect of Fuel EU Maritime is reporting. Reporting has several facets, which you can see on the slide. It needs to be annual. It needs to be complete, so that monitoring and reporting must cover the energy used on both on board the ships and at birth at any time, importantly needs to be consistent, so the methodologies cannot change, so that the independent verifier will receive this information and will process it, can follow it and can see that it is consistently correct. It needs to be updated, and the companies, affected companies, are under the obligation to meet the requirements of Fuel EU Maritime. They need to modify their monitoring plan without delay in a series of situations. And what is also important is that companies must obtain and must store data, monitoring data, for at least 5 years. That's a high threshold to me, and the threshold becomes higher every year. At every stage of implementation. That makes, from a commercial perspective, that makes Europe a very unattractive market to operate in. So the regulation has provided for some compliance incentives, in the sense that, well, okay, if you have a positive sort of compliance balance, you can use it the next year if you have a deficit. Or, okay, you have a deficit this year, but why not borrow your compliance balance from next year, and for next year you can sort of manage your affairs in a way that you make up for that shortfall. Or the compliance balance of multiple vessels can be pooled. The emissions can be pooled between 2 or more ships that have been verified by the same body, so that compliance can be verified across that fleet, so to speak. Practically, the question remains, so how in practice, when being guided by the orders of the charterers, how do we account for any, if there's compliance benefit? Because the charterer has bunkered the vessel with biofuel. The compliance benefit remains with the owner. And I think Dimitris has some thoughts on the issue, which I would like to invite him to share.
Yes, of course. We're quite often, in the past few months, being asked to advise on this. I think there are 2 aspects mainly in that regard. The first one is what Vassilis said, which is that if the charter has spent considerable amounts at bunkering the vessel with expensive biofuel, as agreed, so that the owner complies with the owner's Fuel EU Maritime obligations, it may be that there is a positive compliance balance, as it's called, so the charter wants something in return. Obviously, owners are not keen to do that, amongst other things, because it's actually quite difficult to calculate what that compliance is. In practical terms, usually how they calculate it is they state what the cost would have been had the vessel been bunkered with conventional fuel. So they take the difference in price. That's a practical way. That's a practical way to do it. At the same time, I mean, it's all about how the parties agree things, and that's why it's very important to get the right contractual clauses in the various contracts, to get the balance right, and to get how this benefit or a deficit is split between the parties. Now, another aspect is how a charter can, just because it's caused all this a positive compliance balance, how it can force the owner to take part in pools. That, for example, the charter will have a number of vessels. That particular owner's vessel could have all the best fuel, and then that would fuel through the averaging exercise of the pooling arrangement. So how that interplays with the parties' rights. The second aspect I just wanted to very briefly mention, which actually applies throughout, is when a vessel is sold. So if a vessel is sold, how does it work? As we said earlier, the compliance is done on an annual basis. There are various reporting requirements throughout the year. Class, a vessel's classification society representing the flag is involved to verify often the results. So again, we've been asked a number of times to put together custom, sort of tailor-made provisions that deal with that. And frankly, it all really relates to the negotiating power and the ability to properly calculate a vessel's, compliance balance when it comes to EU ETS, the EUAs involved when it comes to EU ETS, and even a vessel's CII when it comes to that. It's all very complicated in practice. As we said, CII and EU ETS have sort of died a death as far as we're concerned. Purely EU Maritime is still very active because people don't properly all understand it, and they just want to see a sort of commercial pattern of resolution when it comes to issues that it gives rise to. So we'll see what the future holds, and take it from there. Sorry, Vassilis.
It's fine. It's fine. Essentially, this is in a nutshell what we see in terms of practical perspective, in terms of practical perspective arising out of the regulations of the IMO and the EU and practical issues. Now, there's a series of considerations that one can talk about for hours. Like, for example, as a stakeholder, one sees, well, and being active in the market lately, the inherent subjectivity of greenness is something that strikes one immediately. So decarbonization means very different things to very different stakeholders, and there are quite a lot of them. So, for example, for a bunker supplier, decarbonization means biofuels. For a naval architect, it means more efficient design, or it means better coating. So there's a lot of things that have to be done in tandem in order to improve the level of efficiency in global shipping. However, it's our view is that it's quite wrong to follow a sort of one size fits all approach, because there's no one shipping, there is no one pattern, there's no one corporate structure. It's the shipping market and the structure of the shipping market in Denmark, for example, is completely different to that in Greece. Greece is a country of 600 odd or more small outfits that operate in a very different fashion. They have different capabilities. They have very different understanding and sophistication, and very different and potentially a very much more limited sort of ability to quickly adapt to changes that require a heavy financial investment. Aside from owners, however, and charterers, there's also the stakeholders. For example, there's banks, there's other forms of financiers, there's the bunker suppliers. So it's very difficult not to go wrong by not giving this whole ecosystem, the shipping ecosystem, the time it needs to adapt in a natural way to the practical requirements of decarbonization. So what we call the violent push towards compliance will have an effect on this ecosystem, because there are players who are bigger, who are more, or have better financial capabilities, who will be able to invest upfront in this change, pushing out of the way smaller players who are necessary for the balance of the market. This, in due course, it can lead to disruption in the operation of the overall market. Now, in terms of market, what we also touched upon is the fact that the keenness, and quite justified keenness, of the EU to place limits and restrictions and rules to shipping, unfortunately, what it does, it makes other peripheral destinations much more attractive. It seems, I mean, it seems justified in the sense that the EU is doing its part, but on a global scale, it's not helping much. And on a sort of, or a more limited footing, in a more limited aspect, the question is always when there is a financial measure or a financial consequence of failing to do something, the question is immediately, okay, who bears the responsibility and how will this work? How does it operate? How do we structure an agreement necessary to keep the world moving and the market moving and goods traveling to and fro? How do we structure this framework in order to make the movement of goods seamless, free of disputes, and essentially at the very end, cheaper for the end consumer? I don't know, Dimitri, if you want to add anything in terms of
yes, but very quickly, I'm aware that we're sort of running out of time. I think that there are a number of things to note here. This domino effect is very real. So when a few years ago it was very cute to have someone have on their banner that they have an ESG corporate responsibility sort of policy, it was fantastic and all that, but it's now becoming quite real. As we just briefly discussed, there's pressure. The financiers are pressing the owners. The charters financiers may be also pressing. So it's actually quite real. And one may find it very difficult not to be cynical about it. Not because there is some sort of overwhelming and underlying intention towards consolidation, but that's how the matter is perceived. So when I was in a panel not long ago with an EU policymaker in relation to decarbonization, and the EU is finding it very difficult, in my view, to explain why there is such a push to an industry which, as we said earlier, a number of people said it, it is responsible for only 3% of global emissions, when it's responsible also for 90% or between 80 and 90% of global transport. So again, we will resist going into the geopolitical developments. I don't think there's going to be substantial changes going forwards, no matter what Mr. Trump intends to do. There is a real need to tackle decarbonization. The effects of the global climate crisis are quite dire, and we see them all around us. But it strikes me, and whenever I speak before Greek owners, I was invited in one of the DNV and Lloyd's Registers forums recently. I really get angry at them and said, you guys need to get together and understand what it is that you need to do, how you need to collaborate to deal with all this violent push towards compliance. As far as Europe or even the IMO is concerned, when someone talks about shipping, all they think about is the big players, the Maersks, the MSCs, the CMA, CGMs, the really big players. They don't understand shipping in a way that the Greeks do. And believe it or not, if one takes out cabotage vessels, so vessels that do sort of interterritorial trips, the Greek fleet accounts for 24% of the global fleet. So that's a quarter. That's a very substantial percentage here. And it's not one that we see very often advertised. So it's very important for the owners to get together, get their egos out of the way, see how they can pull constructively, see how they can use these regulations to sort of promote their interests. And the final thing I want to say is that shipping, one of the other reasons why all this violent push towards compliance in terms of shipping is unnecessary, is that shipping has shown through the IMO, who's being very sluggish and very slow at the moment, but there might be a reason for that. Shipping has shown that it can self-regulate. Shipping has shown over the past decades that it can deal with sulfur on its own. It can deal with the environment. So having policymakers that don't fully understand how shipping works in practice have very stringent regulations out and making everybody comply with them is something that needs to be very seriously taken note of by the Greek shipping community and the global shipping community, but the Greek shipping community in particular, because in a few years' time, the bulk of Greek ship owners is not going to be able to comply with all these regulations. They will need to, and that's an additional point to make in terms of the younger generation. The fathers and the grandfathers used to see shipping as their sort of their entire life. Their children, in our experience, seems to see it as asset play. So I've got a few assets, let's sell them, let's buy them, see what happens. So, we lawyers are inherently, pessimists. So we don't want to be that today, but shipping has, shipping will continue to go forward. Shipping has gone through emperors, dictators, world wars. It's not going to stop now. But I think people need to be a bit more constructive and a bit more realistic when it comes to what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, and how we can all work together and collaborate to make it happen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think, Dimitris, we can conclude with that comment of how you need to collaborate, because that's one of the problems we see with the startups a lot of times. They are, sometimes I use the word delusional, that they don't understand sometimes the specifics of the problems of the maritime industry. And this is why through this project, we try to bring them together and not just do some educational work. Because yes, I have to admit, as an academic, I know the theory, but it's completely different when you talk with the people that actually have to do the work. So again, Vassilis, Dimitris, thank you very much for your presentation. If anyone has any question, please raise your hand so I can give you the floor.
All answers are free, by the way, I should say,
Sorry, Dimitris?
All answers are for free today.
Yeah, that's, yes, I know about with lawyers how it is. It was actually a funny story about that, about an academic. Someone went and asked for their advice, and then the academic spent like an hour talking with the student or the researcher, and then the student says, "How much do I owe you?" It's like, "What do you mean you owe me? I'm a professor, it's free. My advice, my time is free," which I understand is not the same with everyone. If we don't have any question, I have one question both for Alberto and Vassilis and Dimitris, and Vera, you might also want to answer it. Practically, do you see the personnel, either the workers in a port or the people working on a ship, ready to, not to develop, to apply these solutions or these regulations in their everyday work? Or is there a big problem in actually, even if there is a solution, if there is a data management tool, or even AI is there, or there is biofuel, that of course you need to monitor in a different way, are the staff members ready for this change? I don't know if Dimitris or Vassilis, you want to take this. I promise to everyone it won't take more than maybe 10 minutes, the whole thing.
I think from our perspective, and Dimitris will correct me if he sees things otherwise, it's the way we see things work is eventually a solid charter body is drafted that says what you need to do before you actually need to do it, and the operation is merely executionary. It's like a computer program. You say what you need to do, and then you do that, and that's it. Biofuel, you need to bunker the vessel with biofuels. That's it. You need the charterer in a sort of period charter context. The charterer needs to bunker with biofuels, and that's that. So the answer is that the contracts sort of let the more not sophisticated, but the shore personnel who are closer to the regulation and are closer to and more detached from the nitty-gritty and oil and engine rooms of life of the vessel take hold of how those regulations will be implemented. I don't know, Dimitri, if you see things differently.
I'm going to agree with this. I would only add that both types of personnel that you just described, Alexandros, so the crew members and those working in ports or even in shipping companies, they've been used to doing all of this data collecting for many, many years now, over 15 years, if not more. So I do sense what you may be getting into, and what I would say is that the more complicated the regulatory regimes become, the more challenging and the more difficult it becomes for people to comply. I think that the crew members, save for the officers, are usually very plain people. They just want to do their jobs and get on with it. So there is inevitably a differentiation between officers and the rest of the crew when it comes to a ship. But I think there is a need for training, ongoing training, and most shipping companies do this. They've got ongoing training going on. Whether that training is effective or not, it remains to be seen. There's always been, there have always been accidents at sea. There's collisions, groundings. It happens all the time. People make mistakes, but I think it's a specific responsibility that shipping companies have to ensure that their personnel are as best, as well trained as they could be at all times. No doubt Vera has things to add.
Vera, do you want to add anything? Hi, Vera, we said, do you want to add anything on that, or did Dimitris and Vassilis cover it?
Yeah, I think I agree with the others, and I think that decarbonization in shipping is a very big challenge, and the readiness of people, especially in terms of skills and hard skills, varies across the industry. I mean, alternative fuels knowledge, understanding, let's say, ammonia, hydrogen, biofuels, methanol. I don't know which one will be D1, but many seafarers and shore-based personnel, they don't have the experience in handling, storing, even using it safely. Also, the skills, the whole set changes with digital twins, which is a helpful tool, or route optimization, or even wind-assisted propulsion, batteries. All of that requires new competencies. So it's not, and shipping works well, and shipping is traditional. So there is a need for, I think there is a lot of effort that needs to take place, and effort and cost as well. So the same thing stands for regulations. I mean, this was very well explained about EU ETS and CII, and some inconsistencies that are across the industry, reporting systems as well, and let alone what we didn't touch upon, all these AI and big data and automation as well. So I don't know. Who knows? In the end, maybe we won't need that many people to be trained. I mean, it's the shift towards automation and remote monitoring in shipping. requires completely different set of skills rather than what the Greeks had the skills of operating a vessel in a good way. So now it's more automation and skills needed change. So
but
we'll see.
As Vassilis and Dimitris said, the industry has been adapting the last 50 years
Very
or
well.
a lot more.
Yeah.
So anything needed out there, they will train whoever needs to be trained, and they will they will get used to the new era, let's call it like that. But if it's too complicated and too much, there are other markets out there.
Shipping
Okay,
has
any
always
other
done
question
that.
or any other? Sorry, Vera.
And that's why we have the startups now. These startups, they need to help shipping comply and help shipping adapt. So that's why there are new generation and new things that can help shipping adapt. Shipping has always adapted, so I don't worry about it.
Thank you very much for that. To conclude, basically what will follow up is, apart from a meeting in Athens next month, we are going to have 3 more parallel sessions, if I can call it like that, on cybersecurity, on fuels, on ESGs, where industry experts and startups will present so that they can bring their experiences out to the other startups and so on. And during the end of 25, we're going to have a big event. We haven't decided yet how we're going to do it, where we'll try and bring all this knowledge out to more people based on the feedback we received from these first sessions. So with that, I would like to thank again Phoebe, Vera, Alberto, Vassilis, and Dimitris for being with us. It's almost 7:30.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being so late for us. Thank you to the other participants, to the startups, and to the maritime stakeholders that joined us. And I will see you at the next session. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone.